The next 2 years when we get to start.
Thank you all for coming. We'll get started. We'll try to finish things by half past the hour. So want to thank you for attending the second of our presentations in the Student Scholar Series this year. As I always say, it was instituted to recognize notable legal scholarship produced by members of the student body during the previous academic year, and to foster the skills associated with presenting and defending that scholarship in a professional conference-style setting. Today's presentation will be by third-year student Paul St. Clair. Before I introduce Paul, a few words about the respondent to his presentation. Randy Long is a director of competition and consumer protection law in Microsoft's Washington, D.C. office. Prior to joining Microsoft, he spent over 12 years at the Federal Trade Commission, working primarily in the Bureau of Competition. He began his FTC career as a staff attorney handling merger investigations and litigation before becoming attorney advisor to FTC Chairman Deborah Majoris. I think I said that right. In his final post at the FTC, Randy served as a deputy assistant director in the Mergers One division, overseeing investigations and litigation in the internet, pharmaceutical, medical device, and defense sectors. So we thank him for joining us today. It's a great honor to have him here. Paul St. Clair is a third-year law student at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law. He is a member of the Law and Technology Institute, served on the Catholic University Law Review, and is the immediate past president of the Law and Technology Students Association. Prior to law school, he worked for 3 years in the U.S. Government Affairs Department of Microsoft. I guess you know each other from there. All right. Paul has also served as a legislative intern in Congress and as a research fellow at a lobbying firm. It was while working at Microsoft itself, subject of considerable antitrust scrutiny, that he first became interested in antitrust as a scholarly pursuit. He decided on this particular topic for a law review article after noticing a rising chorus of both left-leaning and right-leaning economists calling for antitrust regulation of big tech. In an area of partisan discord, agreement on tech policy issues is rare and deserves more than just a quick look, he says, a quick look analysis, to borrow an antitrust term. While in school, Paul has continued to gain experience at the intersection of law and technology. I work law and technology while clerking with the Department of Commerce, the Open Technology Institute, and the Federal Communications Commission. And this past summer, he worked in the Technology, Media, and Telecommunications practice group of Morgan, Lewis, and Bacchius, where he will start, pending passage of the bar, as an associate this fall. So I'm going to turn things over to Paul now, his presentation on antitrust in an information age. Paul.
Thank you, Professor Harmon, and thank you all for being here today. I want to start with a quick roadmap of where we're going to go on this journey together today. First, I'll talk about why we're here, why antitrust is relevant, and why I chose this particular topic. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the history of antitrust and how it developed into the jurisprudence and law that it is today. And then next, I'll talk about challenges of the digital economy with regards to antitrust law. And finally, my solutions to these challenges. To give a quick preview, my solutions include updating guidelines that agencies use to analyze mergers, reinvigorating what's called the potential competition doctrine, which you'll hear about later, and having the administration adopt a more aggressive enforcement posture. And all of these solutions don't require congressional intervention. It seems like they have enough on their hands just keeping the government open. So these are steps that the administration and other regulatory bodies can take. So these are not the faces you expected to see in an antitrust presentation. What do these two have in common? Well, they actually are both critics of big tech. And they actually both tweeted on the same day regarding regulation of big tech. Alexandria OcasioCortez tweeted that the biggest threats to journalism right now are monopolies and concentration, and I'll save you from reading that. But in the second of two tweets, he said, what about the now revealed bias by Facebook and many others? So clearly people are paying attention to big tech and the influence it has on politics and society. And it's not just these two. We've seen people like Elizabeth Warren, even Senator Ted Cruz question the size and influence of entities like Facebook and others. So as Professor Harmon mentioned in the intro, it was that these diverse people were talking about scrutinizing big tech that got me interested in it in the first place. So as a former FTC official said, the pot is simmering and it's getting hotter. So first, what is big tech? Who is big tech? It's the names that you know and love to hate. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft is up there. I couldn't find a graphic for you, Randy, sorry. Why do they have so much influence? In short, this is why. They are enormous, and the portion that information sector companies take up of the economy has grown over the last century. Whereas early in the century, there were commodity and resource-intensive production companies moving into a mix of service and industrial companies, and IT now is dominated by information sector companies. Apple is now, this is a little dated, Apple now has over $1 trillion valuation. Some more statistics for you. This is also outdated. Google and Facebook own more than this of the digital ad market. Google owns 88% of the digital search advertising market. Facebook owns 77% of mobile social traffic, and Amazon has a 74% share of the ebook market and every other market on earth. So corporate concentration is up across the board. It's not just IT, but it's noticeably increased from around 5% in '96 to around 8% in 2016 as a share of GDP. And one interpretation of all of this evidence is that the evidence of rising corporate concentration and profits is that it's increasingly challenging for challenging firms to enter these markets and challenge the incumbents, and that they're becoming more entrenched. The other interpretation is that we're just seeing more efficient economies of scale, that globalization has led to consolidation, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing. However, it is clear that mistrust of big tech is on the rise. So big tech is blamed for lots of problems: online hate speech, algorithmic bias, privacy violations, political interference, you name it. The list goes on. And antitrust has been brandished about as a tool, a panacea to throw at all of these problems, bust up big tech, and then all of our problems are solved. In reality, antitrust is developed into a very specific set of laws and regulations administered primarily by the FTC and DOJ in this country, and it's aimed at protecting competition and consumers. It's not to protect elections or prevent the degradation of journalism, which are great goals, noble goals, but those are other paper topics. Antitrust is aimed specifically at protecting consumers and competition. There are a surprising number of Jeff Bezos' octopus graphics on the web. So how did we get here? This is a lithograph called The Bosses of the Senate. You know, big steel, big copper coming in through the monopolist interest overlooking the Senate. And I think that you could easily add big tech into this picture if it was produced today. So antitrust was originally developed to protect small businesses and ordinary men against industrial concentration, the power of singular firms controlling whole industries, and the rise of corporate profits. And the two major statutes guiding antitrust are the Sherman Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. So the Sherman Act was a political response to an economic condition of rising concentration. Following the Industrial Revolution, it became possible to control wide swaths of the country, and in fact, that's what happened. Trusts and monopolies ended up controlling entire industries and driving up prices for the consumer and small businesses. The Sherman Act literally, the text literally reads, it outlaws every contract, combination, or conspiracy that is in restraint of trade or commerce. Every contract, in restraint of commerce. The Supreme Court helpfully pointed out in a 1978 opinion that the Sherman Act is among the least precise statutes enacted by Congress, and, quote, one problem presented by the language of Section 1 of the Act is that it cannot mean what it says. Because of this imprecision, the Sherman Act has been flexible over time, but on the other hand, it's also imprecise and able to be kind of manipulated to political ends. It's subject to interpretation and therefore will lead to interpretation. So next we had the Clayton Act in 1914, and this is the same time that Congress created the FTC to administer and enforce the country's antitrust laws. People like Justice Brandeis were noticing that big companies can control and have a lot more data than smaller companies and control over consumers. And so Congress expanded the Sherman Act through the Clayton Act. You heard similar language regarding the creation of the Sherman Act when Congress passed the Clayton Act, such as the concentration of wealth and property in the United States under the control of a few individuals has grown to such an enormous extent that unless checked, it will ultimately threaten the perpetuity of our institutions. So I think that rings true today. And the Clayton Act, Section 7, prohibited the acquisition by one corporation the stock of another corporation when such an acquisition would result in a substantial lessening of competition or tend to create a monopoly in any line of commerce. So the Clayton Act aims to prevent anti-competitive behavior in its incipiency before it happens. It's a reasonable probability of harm standard, and it's aiming to prevent rather than retroactively police anti-competitive conduct. Other notable developments in the law: in 1950, Congress updated the Clayton Act with the Seller-Kefauver amendments to close some loopholes that corporations inevitably found, and then in 1976 passed the statute that forms our modern jurisprudence, the HartScottRodino Antitrust Act, which created a pre-merger review process for mergers above a certain value threshold. So whereas before antitrust law was basically administered through private litigation, this changed it into a regulatory affair where any merger above a value threshold has to go through government review. And if this review indicates that it's likely to be harmful to competition, they may make rules for the merger, structural remedies, behavioral remedies, or they can prevent it outright. Like I mentioned, it's a political doctrine, and as such, there's been different interpretations of it over the years. The most recent incarnation is hipster antitrust, which is it's a kind of an oxymoron, I guess, but it goes back a long way. The first incarnation of what you would, I guess, call hipster antitrust was called the multi-valued approach, popularized in the 50s and 60s and embraced by the Warren Court, which took in socio-political factors into account when doing an economic analysis. So you could say this merger would lead to inequality, social inequality, things of that nature. In response to that, or just maybe independently, the Chicago School in the 1970s developed a Chicago School of Economics that said, no, like forget all the socio-political stuff, let's just look at the economics, just look at the metrics, and focus on the bottom economic line. And this was embraced in the 1970s, which subsequently saw a wave of corporate consolidation. And that era was the time that the definition of consumer welfare really was cemented into policy, which continues to this day. So consumer welfare is the idea, the goal, basically, the metric, the golden metric of antitrust. People like Robert Bork on the left of the Chicago School said, on the left. Sorry. I had to look him up. Yeah. I did not watch the whole confirmation hearing. So he thinks that consumer welfare means both welfare for producers and consumers, and that there's a hard line on econometrics, whereas Robert Pitofsky, who's a former FTC chairman and dean of Georgetown, embraced the multi-value approach and wanted consumer welfare to take in other factors. So how does the FTC and DOJ evaluate mergers today? Like this. So they have what are called the merger guidelines. There's both horizontal guidelines and non-horizontal guidelines, which I'll refer to interchangeably as vertical guidelines, which are used to evaluate. They don't have the power of law or regulation, but they are exactly what they say are guidelines used to evaluate mergers coming through their offices. Robert Pitofsky stated that the guideline process in many ways has had the most important influence on antitrust policy in the last 50 years. So with horizontal mergers, the harm to competition is pretty obvious. There are X number of competitors in a marketplace, they merge in the same market, and there are less competitors. With vertical mergers, it's usually a supplier and a customer merging in a vertical relationship, and the harms are a little less clear. But this is what the antitrust agencies use to evaluate vertical mergers. I'll give you a second so you can read it. Please don't read that. The non-horizontal guidelines have two stages of analysis. The first stage focuses on structural criteria of the marketplace and the potential mergers, and look at things typical like market concentration, barriers to entry, target firms, market share. And then if those factors lead the agencies to believe that it will be anti-competitive, they can look at other factors in the second step of the analysis. And the companies then have the burden of proof to show that no, this will actually be a pro-competitive merger, which they always say. And the guidelines generally only provide that the department, in this case Department of Justice, will consider whatever evidence the merging firms deem relevant to show that the adverse inferences drawn from the objective factors are unreliable. So these look pretty thorough, and you can take any inference from the evidence. So what's the problem? No, Prince is not the problem. While the horizontal guidelines have been updated as recently as 2010, the vertical guidelines have not been updated since 1984, when Prince's When Doves Cry was the #1 Billboard hit. Great music video. And neither the Supreme Court nor a higher court has addressed a vertical merger case since 1979. So we're kind of lacking on guidance in this regard. So now let's talk a little bit about the potential competition doctrine. It enables antitrust enforcers to challenge prospective business combinations on the basis of potentially stifling future competition in a relevant market. So there's two types of potential competition. There's actual potential competition, firms that are equipped and able to enter a market, and there's perceived potential competition, which is firms that could enter a market or are poised to, but still drive an incumbent firm to act on the basis of that perception. So just for example, really quick, if Microsoft acquired Google, they would not have to enter the search market, but because they perceive Google as a threat, a potential entrance to the OS market. Sorry, I'm getting this backwards. So basically, in this instance, we're at the last step. But if Google had not yet created a search engine, but was a competitor to Microsoft, but Microsoft perceived that Google could enter the search market, it will drive Microsoft to innovate and create its own search engine, which it did in Bing. Otherwise, it could have just bought the Google search engine. Struggled through that one. All right. These theories of perceived potential competition are difficult to prosecute because it, quote, becomes a morass of intractable legal issues touching all but immeasurable economic phenomena, often with heavy emphasis on the subjective testimony of corporate insiders. So I'm not the only one who thinks it's hard. So now let's talk about challenges of the contemporary digital economy regarding merger analysis. So there's been an explosion in free services. You don't pay for your Facebook, you don't pay for your Google directly. But then there's other things like Expedia and OpenTable and all these ad-supported services that the consumer does not pay for. There's been a rise in two-sided platforms such as Amazon and eBay, and the list goes on, that you're all very familiar with, and concurrently the rise of big data. But one question remains, is this all a good thing or is it a bad thing? So with the rise of big data in particular, it's happening. And in 2002, economist Joseph Stiglitz described it, the increasingly commodity-like nature of data, whereas before with Standard Oil, it was a literal commodity. Now data is becoming our information economy's resource. And it's been suggested that controlling this resource can entrench monopoly power. World Economic Forum President Carl Schwab wrote a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, detailing the rise of analytics and AI and internet-enabled sensors, along with the rise of big data. And so it's not necessarily, the rise of big data is here to stay. And we've got this rapid life cycle in the technology industry. So what do we do about it? So one option is to prevent vertical mergers, just stop them. Facebook acquired Instagram in 2012. Randy just told me that when it had 27 million users. At the time, Instagram had 13 employees, and it was acquired for $1 billion. People argue that if Facebook was prevented from buying Instagram, Instagram could have grown up on its own and challenged Facebook, enabling both companies to innovate independently, and therefore consumers would benefit. So why did I pick vertical mergers in particular? It's very difficult because you can't say that Instagram would have hit what's closer to 1 billion now users without being acquired by Facebook. It might have, but there's no necessarily no way to tell. Horizontal mergers are too easy. In a vertical merger, one firm buys somebody in its vertical supply chain, and there's a couple of principal concerns. One is foreclosure, that if for example, the final assembly plant buys all the retail, that other assemblers will be blocked from using those retail outlets. The consumer won't benefit. This is the case in a quintessential case called Brown Shoe, which a shoe manufacturer bought a bunch of shoe stores, and the government subsequently stepped in and prevented that. Now it's less about the actual product going into the store and more about a manufacturer or an upstream firm foreclosing other firms from the data or network that the downstream firm has. For example, if when Facebook bought Instagram, other entities were prevented from the social data that Instagram owned, whereas it might have otherwise shared that information with other people. That's not to say that all vertical integration is bad. It leads to information sharing, efficiencies, R&D efficiencies. One of my favorite companies, DJI, the drone maker, is famously entirely vertically integrated. It leads to rapid product iteration. So there are benefits. So if we prevent Facebook from acquiring any more Instagrams, that'll solve everything. And let's go a step further and break up Facebook into a bunch of baby Facebooks. And that'll solve everything too, right? Not necessarily. This was Standard Oil and its chart over the past century, whereas before it was a monopoly, now it's an oligopoly. It's progress. So we're here, and now we just need to rely on these guidelines, right? No. Guidelines are outdated. They don't reflect current economic thinking that's transpired in the last 20, 30 years. They don't account for whatever's happening here. And they don't reflect the actual practices of the FTC or DOJ. So here are a couple of indicators, major issues that we need to address moving forward in antitrust analysis. The first of these is network effects. In 2007, Google acquired DoubleClick, which was an ad serving company, and Google was an ad intermediation company. The commission allowed it to merge 4-to-1, but the dissenting commissioner wrote that Google could acquire data and contribute to network effects, and that the combined firms will create a far richer source of ad data, and it raises long-term competition questions. and she doubted that any other firm would be able to amass a data set of the scope and size and overcome these network effects. The commission passed it ostensibly on the grounds that Apple was in the ad intermediation market, but Apple is no longer in the ad intermediation market, and as you know, Google and Facebook dominate that market. Second, we can talk about switching costs. The costs incurred from a user switching from one platform or product to the other. You're all familiar with saved passwords on your browsers, things of that nature that prevent you from using other browsers, or having a bunch of Twitter followers and not wanting to switch to a brand new platform that you don't have any followers on. So those are real, and there's evidence that it increases the incumbency of entrenched firms. Foreclosure, I spoke a little bit about before, but it's actually more of a worry when the property being foreclosed is an intangible asset that's easily duplicated. So, for example, when NBC Universal acquired, when Comcast went to acquire NBC Universal in 2011, the government made them divest Hulu because they were worried that Hulu was going to be, Comcast was going to prevent other content providers from giving Hulu to their customers. And you saw that in the AT&T Time Warner merger analysis as well, where the concern was that Time Warner would, its properties would be not given to other competitors to AT&T. Finally, we touched quickly on you don't pay for these services anymore, and it's hard because before economists used price and quantity as their metrics, and it's hard to do math with the number 0. And that it's hard to look at a 13-person startup and say it's going to be the next billion-dollar company. Not only that, but the life cycle of a Silicon Valley company, they all have huge valuations, and not all of them necessarily pan out. So even using money as a metric is not that effective. And finally, big tech has a lot better tools to pick out the winners and losers than the government does at this moment. So, whether it's private venture capital or the firms themselves, it's difficult for regulators to look at the same companies and see the same things. And not only that, they can use things like pricing algorithms and AI to assist them in their assessment of potential competitors. So, what are we to do about all of this? Well, I used 3 principles from my research that seem to have stood the test of antitrust time. These principles are broad consensus, to be simple and flexible and administrable. This is Judge Richard Posner, who in the year 2000 said, he said that he fears that antitrust law may no longer be equipped to govern the new economy. And he said, quote, "Indeed, I cannot even glimpse a solution." And he's got much better glasses than I do. So this is what I think we should do from here. First, I advocate for retaining the consumer welfare standard. First of all, there's not a clear replacement, general welfare, allocative efficiency. The replacements are basically hard to measure with certainty and could not conceivably be done by agencies or in litigation. There's broad consensus on consumer welfare, and it's already the standard, which helps. There also should be a process to update the vertical guidelines. 1984 was a great year, but I think that following the advice of the ABA Presidential Transition Committee in 2012 and 16, agencies should adopt a cooperative process to update these guidelines, particularly focusing on the potential competition doctrine, particularly focusing on network effects and big data. I think maybe Randy has a little bit to say more about those particular aspects, but the guidelines don't necessarily mention two-sided marketplaces and other phenomena of the information economy. Finally, I think that there's steps that agencies can take immediately to reduce the information asymmetry. I believe that they should adopt a more aggressive enforcement stance, and you saw this happen actually recently with the AT&T Time Warner high-profile challenge where the DOJ currently lost, but is appealing the decision to allow the merger. So what would reducing information asymmetry look like? Putting data scientists, economists, product managers, people familiar with the tech industry embedded in these agencies with the antitrust lawyers to be able to explore these phenomena more fully, and ultimately providing more resources, whether it be financial or human, to these agencies. And it's actually a tenet of Elizabeth Warren's 2020 platform to give more money to these agencies. So speaking of 2020, where does antitrust go from here? I think you're seeing a lot of action in the House and Senate on this, but primarily in the House regarding the current proposed T-Mobile Sprint transaction, which is horizontal, but I think creates a lot of noise regarding antitrust. Not only that, you're seeing 2020 candidates line up behind this issue. It's just extremely popular. As I mentioned, it's a very populist sentiment right now to try to figure out, what's going on with big tech. Finally, if you look to Europe as a model, they're generally further down the road of examining the effects of data on competition. And they've got, different laws and norms surrounding privacy and data. However, I think that you can look to Europe as a model for policing competition in big tech. And again, I think that's a topic of a different paper. Finally, I just want to say thank you to everybody who helped me along the way. Randy Long was a tremendous asset and advocate. Professors Perez, Winston, and LaBelle were extremely helpful in this process, and the entire CUA law community helped me, including alumni and students. I also thank everybody from whom I borrowed graphics, including Professor Stephen Salop and Carl Shapiro and many others. I want to thank my parents for their support, and most of all, Ariel Garapi, my wife, for being here today and supporting me through this wonky topic. Thank you very much.
Sure. So where were the thanks for Trump and AOC for inspiring you? First, so thank you to Catholic University for inviting me, and thank you for Paul for considering me for this program. I have to commend Catholic. This is a tremendous program. I think law school education must have gotten a lot better since I was in law school, so it's certainly a lot more engaging. This is very impressive. And secondly, Paul, congratulations.
Thanks.
This is you've demonstrated a very sophisticated understanding of the issues and the practical problems that are presented here, more so than many people who profess to understand the issues. So I actually understand you're planning to go into telecom. That might be a mistake. I urge you to reconsider. But I'm sure you'll master that too. So your recommendations, I'm generally supportive of them because I do think that they are realistic, practical, and most importantly, achievable. Since we've talked, I'm beginning to wonder whether legislative involvement wouldn't be wise, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But I agree that if you're going to make improvements in our current regime, it's probably best to do so in a way that the antitrust agencies can in strides that they can take on their own to address a situation that's happening now. One of the things that I think that I'd like to get into first in terms of our conversation is I'd like to talk a little bit about the consumer welfare standard and your recommendation to retain that. I think that's important and foundational. But even before we get to that, I want to comment on one of the things that struck me as particularly good judgment in your recommendations is that many people who have concerns about the state of antitrust enforcement today, and not just with respect to big tech, but just antitrust enforcement generally, look at a lot of the dialogue that we've had in the United States and globally around the concerns that there's excessive concentration, and immediately move towards a thought of breakup, which is perhaps a rational response. but it does present some real problems, and I'm speaking now as a former antitrust enforcer, not in my current role. Especially with regard to tech, many of these companies that are the focus of some of the concerns are companies that depend, or a lot of their value proposition is based upon this concept of network effects, where Facebook is a terrific example of this, where the more value, I'll put it this way, every additional user to Facebook makes the program or the service more valuable in itself. So what is Facebook with a network that's just at Harvard and Harvard students? It's pretty neat to Harvard students. Everybody would want to be on it. When it gets to be, maybe regional, or it gets to be nationwide, it becomes much more valuable because you want to be on it because your aunt and uncle are on it and your college roommate is on it. It's intuitive. You get that. If you break up a company like Facebook and you have 5 mini Facebooks, does the world all of a sudden gravitate towards Facebook 2 or Facebook 3? And you end up perhaps in the same situation as you started in. So it's not as simple as just breaking up a company and starting again and hoping that 2 of them end up competing with each other. So I think that's a practical observation, and your focus on looking to mergers so that a big tech or a company in another space doesn't buy the next innovative technology that comes along and cements its market power for another 10, 15, 20 years. So I think that's sound and practical. That unfortunately also has its challenges. We should talk about that for a moment. But let's go back one final note. You talked a lot about data and its importance in dealing with the big tech issues. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think this is an important challenge for the agencies to address. I'll observe that every company now is a data company. So it's of importance not just to big tech, but when you think about many of the industrial companies that you might think about now are doing incredible things around data, and their data that they generate, whether you're looking at Boeing and all of the data that's spun off a 737 every time it lands, that sort of information, or Siemens with its elevators, all of that information will end up being incredibly important to innovation going forward, and the antitrust agencies will have to understand that as well. Not to deflect anything from the tech sector, but just pointing out that it's an issue of tremendous importance across the economy. So I thought we should talk about the consumer welfare standard first, because it's, as I said, I think it's foundational to your recommendations, but also it's foundational to antitrust. So what, if you could expand a little bit on your rationale for why you want to retain the consumer welfare standard going forward. There's a lot of critique out there. You mentioned in your talk some of the folks that have questioned whether the consumer welfare standard is a hindrance to antitrust enforcement, and wouldn't we be better if we kind of ditched it and went to something else? If you look at the legislative history around antitrust, the Sherman Act, or even the Clayton Act, you'll find any justification that you want to find for the law and its objectives is in there. Whether it's political or ensuring that we end up with an agrarian Jeffersonian society, you can probably find that in there as well. So we ended up through iterative process at the place where antitrust is founded upon, or isn't founded upon, but turns upon a consumer welfare approach. Why do you think it's an approach that should be retained going forward?
I think, first of all, thank you for your comments on my suggestions. You helped me craft those, so I appreciate in some ways.
Your ideas.
Thank you very much. I think retaining the consumer welfare standard is important, because if you look at the reasons for the criticism against it, there are things that antitrust can't necessarily address. So issues like privacy or, for example, election interference, things like that. If that's your reason for breaking up Facebook, you need to go and pass a privacy law. You need to go and pass a cybersecurity law. You don't necessarily need to take antitrust action. So I think that on the one hand, changing the goalposts at this point, would not necessarily solve the problem you're seeking to solve, which is a lot of the noise out there. Second of all, I think that it makes sense from the perspective that it's the smallest economic unit you can look at in an economy is the consumer. As a consumer, I like that my welfare is being looked after by the government, and it'd be hard to justify the government looking after corporate welfare, in an antitrust or a merger evaluation. So I think that's primarily it. But then a kind of obvious reason is that it is the standard. It's been adopted over the last 50 years by domestic and international regulatory bodies. So I think that it's got a lot of entropy. So for that reason, it would be good to retain it as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There's a, should we say decades? We can't say centuries of jurisprudence that incorporate the consumer welfare standard. And it's not like the agencies can waltz into court tomorrow and start advocating for either blocking a merger because they're concerned that it will somehow enable election interference, or that a company is using it to suck up too much data. Which actually brings me to a related point. Last week, I don't know if anybody saw this, but there was a decision. I'm going to try to use my German properly. The Bundys Cartel Amt, which is basically the German antitrust authority, they came down with a decision. Speaking of Facebook, they just held that after a 3-year investigation, that Facebook had abused its dominance in Germany by combining data from different sources, or amongst its different services. So WhatsApp, your graphic is gone. WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, and
Messenger.
Messenger. Thank you. Messenger, as well as the data that they comb from you as you search around the internet and look for that pair of shoes, and then pop up those ads for you for that pair of shoes after you didn't buy them. By combining all of the data from those different sources into one profile, they had exploited users. So not a type of harm that is allowed under U.S. antitrust law, but what the Bundys Cartel Amt said was they are now using this the Facebook's dominance as a way of obtaining a data privacy remedy, and they're prohibiting Facebook from doing that further. I think that reflects a little bit on some of the discomfort you might have with abandoning the consumer welfare standard, but maybe you could comment on that and just comment, if you would, on how retaining the consumer welfare standard would lead to a more administrable field of law here in this country.
Yeah, I think that brings up a lot of good points. First being that it's hard to put a value on data, and there are attempts to do it. Economists have been trying to do it. Health value is more valuable than your location data, or what that might be more valuable. But the fact is that there's not a metric for data right now, and so therefore the amount of harm caused by having one company such as Facebook compile this data is not ascertainable. And in the long run, maybe just on its face, even consumers benefit from this data. I know people who like being served ads. It's creepy, but you get the products you want ultimately. So there's not necessarily harm in a strict definition of that. I do think it's worth trying to put a value on data, so that, for example, when you're looking at the merger guidelines, and you're looking at whether the preventing the merger would increase potential competition and innovation in the sector, maybe you could put a value on, well, what would these two social networks combined, what would that value be? And what are their individual values? And so instead of having, a market valuation be your threshold for a pre-merger review process, maybe it's a value of the data sets if they fall into certain, tech, telecom. I mean, you mentioned that manufacturing, any number of industries that have valuable data sets. So that's a part of the analysis moving into it. The same thing with social networks, like you mentioned. I think if social networks or what are called, social graph data sets are included in the analysis rather than just being, a secondary factor they can look at if there are other competition-related concerns, that consumers would be better off. And so I don't think that you necessarily have to abandon the consumer welfare standard to get there.
So shifting gears, another thing that I think that's worthy picking up on from your presentation is you called for a more aggressive use of the potential competition doctrine to look at to make sure that dominant firms aren't what's the language of the Microsoft decision, acquiring incipient competitors, or basically squashing incipient competition. So that's a very sound suggestion, and I think that builds on the clear objectives of the Clayton Act. So I think, as a premise to my question, I think it's useful to describe a little bit of the differences in the way I think specifically the FTC has approached antitrust enforcement in two kind of tech areas. One being high tech in medical devices and pharmaceuticals, clearly an area with a lot of innovation and research and development, and it's inarguably high technology, versus what is more traditionally called the high tech sector, which is the one I work in, which is your IT, internet, online world. So in the medical device pharmaceutical arena, we have a regulatory structure that's in place to make sure that products that come to market are safe and efficacious, and I don't remember what, honestly, it's been a while, so I don't remember what the exact standard is, but essentially I believe that they have to be, maybe an FDA expert in here, have to be proven to be at least as good or better than something that's already on the market. And they go through years-long process to demonstrate this. They have phase 1 of development, phase 2, and in order to achieve your in-human trials, whether it's a medical device or a pharmaceutical, at some point you have to have proven that it's not going to harm somebody, and then you have to, in phase 3, you show efficacy. And so you have this clear regime set up that ends up proving to the antitrust regulators that, hey, this company that is coming up with this new and innovative product, this product might actually be impactful in the marketplace. Switch over to the high tech sector, or the tech sector. It's completely unregulated by and large. How are one of the antitrust agencies able to separate the wheat from the chaff, or whatever you want to say, when they look at an acquisition, whether it's a Google Waze or a Facebook Instagram, or Microsoft buying one of the apps that we bought recently, the Sunrise calendar app? How do you sort out which one of these is pro-competitive and which one of these is potentially anti-competitive in the long run? Facebook, Instagram is one that's in the news a lot, and and perhaps justifiably so. I think a lot of people identify with it because everyone uses Facebook, right? So you articulate a desire to expand the potential or greater use of the potential competition doctrine. Any thoughts on how the FTC has this built-in system using the FDA process on one side of the economy, but what do you have you given any thought to what the antitrust agencies might look to in the tech sector to try to figure out which of which of the transactions would benefit from going forward and which are the ones that should be blocked?
I think it's a good question, but the premise that tech could go through a years-long multi-phase trial is just not tenable in the tech industry. It's just one of the difficulties is that it's just too high velocity. The life cycle of a company could be 6 months, in which time it could go from 27 million users to a billion. So I think that's a problem with any type of government review, is that it just takes too long for industry, and they just won't stand for it. They'll go to other countries or otherwise not innovate, which is the exact opposite of your original goal. And so I think that's kind of the million-dollar question. I think that agencies can adopt practices in the industries themselves, learn from them about how they identify acquisition targets. And it is an art and a science. And I think too, you need to look at, another point, you just need to look at patterns. So if a company is buying 20, calendaring apps, well, then are they foreclosing other companies from developing the same type of technology? If each one of those apps has only like a 5% chance of challenging an incumbent, and they buy all 20, well, then what are your chances of actually preventing a true competitor? So I think that in short, no, there doesn't need to be a multi-phase review period, but at the same time, the potential competition doctrine does need to be invigorated. I'll defer to the professionals on that one, but I think it is a multidisciplinary approach between everybody from venture capitalists to economists.
So last question from me. I was wondering if, since the time that you worked on this, and you said you were focused on practical suggestions for improvement that the agencies could implement themselves. I was wondering if you've been able to give some thought to, what were the ones that you would take on first if you're making Del Rahim or Joe Simons? And by the way, I got to say that since Paul wrote this, someone's reading his mind. The FTC has taken up an initiative called the 21st Century. Competition and Consumer Protection in the 21st Century. They're going on a 6 or 7 month long process to re-examine across the scope of the entire authority what's working and what isn't, and how everything should be updated. And they spent 3 days on potential competition and 3 days on vertical mergers. So someone's listening. I think you should submit your paper as a public comment to the process.
Thank you. Yeah, I plan on it, and I think they were just using my paper basically as a roadmap to do what they were doing. So I think in the first instance, I don't think I have enough experience watching industries evolve as one of those people, but I do think that they're undertaking the right steps. So they're convening literal workshops, maybe in rooms like this one. This slide is actually from Steven Salop, who gave this presentation at one of those workshops. And they're also interagency, the FCC is participating, multiple agencies are participating in this process. So it seems to be right now they're in the listening phase. It was simultaneously vindicating and frustrating to have them doing the steps that I was suggesting before I could get this paper out there. But on the other hand, I'm glad that this problem is widely recognized and seems to be an area of intense scrutiny. I think in terms of where they go after this learning tour, I think you can look to Europe as a model. Not only with the GDPR, the data protection regulations, but with other norms regarding data and privacy. So whereas with us, it's more of a opt-out system, they've got more opt-in systems. So I think that you're going to see the relationship between consumers and companies change over the next 5 years or so, even in the next administration, or this administration, see a federal privacy law that I think will change consumers' expectations, which, ultimately having consumers change their behavior is a lot easier than going in and imposing government intervention on a merger. So if you're voting with your pocketbooks or your data, that's the goal, is to have a free and prosperous competitive economy. So hopefully you wouldn't need intervention in that case. But again, I don't pretend to be a professional, but yeah, I'd staff up on data scientists and software engineers.
Well, I tell you what, in the interest of time, we'll have to get to class and things, and if I think y'all, any questions from anyone else has, and perhaps I'll entertain them afterwards. I want to thank Paul very much. Don't go. Gotta give you a plaque for being the second of our student scholars this year, second only in appearance, not in quality. It was a wonderful presentation. Randy, thanks so much for being part of this. It was it's great to hear the kind of control and the level of intelligence that some of our students have and can display. So he's promised to submit this for publication, and I hope you'll do that, because it's a great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming.